All right, Phil, take it away.
Well, I've spent about a week immersed in Ukrainian matters and thinking about some of the things from my background and a lifetime of studying of military history. And I, I, I'm guarded about historical parallels, and yet I think that I have to say something about a parallel between a military operation which I've studied my whole life. June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched the largest land military operation in the history of the world, and that would include up to the present, in which 4 million German soldiers drove across Russia and Ukraine and nearly took Russia out of the war in one of the most surprising military actions we had seen. But it turned out that because of Hitler's lack of preparation, underestimation of the Ukrainian situation and the Russian situation, and his total misreading of the Russian will to fight, that he ended up dug in, trapped outside of Moscow. Now, his optimism was such that in June he expected to be in Moscow by October, and no winter uniforms were issued to Russian soldiers. So they were expected that they would either succeed or freeze. Well, basically, they froze, and I look at the Ukrainian situation, and for me, originally, I said some not non-complimentary things about the Ukrainian government and about their premier Zelensky, and you might say that I fell for the Russian propaganda, and I think that in a way, Putin fell for his own propaganda because he once once the attack broke out with its full savagery, uh, he basically it was expected that the Ukrainians would just roll over and they would have a parade and there would be a new premier and Putin would get what he wanted. But there was sort of a secret that nobody seemed to be paying attention to. And I really I've grown to like Zelensky a lot because he said, well, everyone was worried about what Putin was going to do. No one paid any attention to what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to make a jump, and I'm going to make a jump to something that I've been studying for the last 20 or 25 years since I was in library and information studies at UW Madison, and that's what they call Moore's law. And basically, Moore's law says twice as fast and half as expensive within 18 months. I'm this is like trying to call in from a train station, but I'm going to go ahead. And what basically happened with this explosion of AI technical knowledge is that it spun over to the field of weaponry. And 15 minutes before before I worked, I got ready to tape this show. Uh, Apparently now in Ukraine, on a non-governmental level, they're crowdfunding intelligent reconnaissance and attack drones, which 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 okay, all right. Basically, the thing to know is Ukrainians have been kicking Russian ass because Russians did not anticipate first the fighting will of the Ukrainian people, but secondly the expanse of technological knowledge. Uh, for example, one of the drones that Ukraine has purchased from Turkey was developed about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago, in a joint partnership between the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Turkish government. Now, the reason that that is so significant is the US government would not fund or support the project to sell drones to Turkey. So Turkey went ahead and manufactured their own world-class drones, became an exporter of military hardware, and now is basically leading the business. And the business is to produce these ever more awesome non-human piloted weapons. I remember this conversation I had not so many months ago, and I had the privilege of talking to a naval officer who had been a carrier fighter pilot. This is going to be the most important thing I say in the whole presentation. And so I asked him what he thought the chances would be of a US carrier based aircraft surviving in a dogfight against the top of the line Russian fighter. And he said, well, it's a draw. Probably you couldn't say whether the human capability would be sufficient to stand up against the other one. But that's 6 months ago. Now, the Russian Air Force is pretty much grounded. They don't want to go up against this. They don't want to risk a $100 million jet and a pilot with several $1 million worth of training to be shot down by something that can be purchased on the open market for $3 or $4 million. This is going to change warfare. The other thing that I'm sort of coming out on this, for the last couple hundred years, there's been a fear of Russia in the West. And there's the idea that the Cossacks would come running in with their sabers on horseback in this crazy Russian charge and cut the Europeans to pieces. That if you were a policymaker sitting around at Sandhurst, the British Academy, in 2000 in 1900 or something like that, you would be writing papers and having panel discussions and bringing books out that your friends could write introductions on how to conduct the best cavalry campaign possible. And yet, the machine gun makes cavalry irrelevant. I once talked to someone, a German, who had actually fought on the Eastern Front, and he said it would bring tears to your eyes to see what automatic weapons would do to a cavalry charge. And so what it seems to me is that that's one. There are other examples, but the idea of people, non-government people, doing crowdfunding to get weapons to the Ukrainians is absolutely fascinating. Let's go a little bit to the no-fly zone. Why isn't America enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Are we afraid that Putin's going to be mad at us, not like us? What we have, Russia has 1/10 of the military expenditure we have. If you look at the forces lining up, you would say that they're barely a first level country. You know, the Russian military budget is not much larger than Saudi Arabia. Ours is the biggest. We have the biggest economy. We have the biggest military budget, and yet we seem paralyzed. This is a strange way for a pacifist to talk, but at the same time, we know that appeasement is not going to work because if it worked, we wouldn't have a Russian army in the Ukraine. We would have a Russian army doing the symbolic sort of threat that major powers do, but you would have no invasion. And so it's kind of ironic that the actually I didn't believe in collective security a month ago, certainly 2 months ago. I thought we could get out. That was all we needed to do, and they would solve it themselves. Well, I don't believe that anymore. I believe that there's got to be some kind of reference to collective security where America is not necessarily targeted. I listened to some as the object of world disdain for intervening. We're not that. We've dealt with some pretty bad guys. You've talked about that, Brock, when we were talking about Gaddafi's end, so to speak, and Putin's nightmare that he was going to end up like that. Because when a dictatorship falls, it falls hard, and it takes a lot of people with them. So now we have, I'm not sure where it goes, but it may be that Europe does take care of this itself, and America makes the arms deal. I mean, there was something called this. This is trying to make a reference to previous American policy, and to talk about military actions other than something that just takes place on the battlefield. I hope they still teach in high school history the idea that America was the arsenal for democracy. And what that meant was in 1940, almost no one wanted America to get involved in another European war. Hitler was underestimated as a threat, and Americans just don't like being in the army. They don't like taking orders. And I believe that in 1940, the American Army had a total manpower of something like 30,000 at the most. I mean, there were like 22 countries ahead of us, and I think Portugal was next. And yet we were able to take this industrial structure, which we had, and supply China, Britain, France, not France, where France fell, but China, Britain, and Russia to a significant part of their military capabilities. For example, in the case of Russia fighting against Germany, 20% of the military production from that the Russians used came from United States Lend-Lease. And that same Lend-Lease kept American workers employed. Well, Eric Sevareid once said, the thing that people don't understand about Washington in 1940 is that America had an army of the unemployed ready to go to work in the defense industry. And that same army of the unemployed, when they came home, didn't want to be part of the army. They wanted to buy houses, have families, go to school on the GI Bill, and build a country. I talked to one ex-Nazi about that. He said he had never seen anything like the American capabilities, where every Jeep had a radio and where they could have been kings of Europe, and all they wanted to do was come home and see their family. That's a pretty. It moves me. It moves me to talk about it because my uncles were part of it. Now I think I may have gone a little over the top here, but I think I'm wondering what is it that we seem to be so afraid of. On one side, we're afraid of not seeming to be nice, and on the other side, we're we're afraid of making Putin mad at us. I don't know. You got any questions for me or anything?
No, I mean I could speculate, but I don't know if I want to like put it out there yet because I haven't thought it through good enough. And um, I do think the technology thing is really interesting
Yeah.
because so it seems to me like it, your point of like being afraid to respond to Putin, and I don't really know how much I want to go into that because I do have some thoughts, but like I said, they're not thought through, so I have to be careful what I say. But
Yeah.
remember like 6 months ago or maybe a year, maybe it was a year ago, I don't remember, but we would get all these ransomware attacks from these Russian-based hackers.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like out of fear, remember, Biden was saying, "Oh, Mr. Putin, please tell your people not to do this anymore," kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, well, come to find out, like when during this invasion, and I didn't read it fully, but I saw some reference to the fact that there's 300,000 coordinated hackers that are, from the beginning of this thing have just made technological life over in Russia a living hell, basically. I mean, remember in the beginning they were, basically hacking all kinds of their government websites were down. And so basically it sounds like between Anonymous and all the other hackers that have just
Yeah.
kind of come on collectively, and as you were saying, they crowd funded these drones or whatever, but the hackers have just kind of kept them on the defensive so much, tying them down, making
Yeah.
their systems inoperable that they don't seem to be able to launch any attacks because they're just too busy trying to fix all the problems of everything incoming their way. So I think that's really interesting because that's like a crowdfunding thing, and that is made possible. Like all these hackers are able to communicate because of technology, because of Moore's law.
Yeah.
It's like 10 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been a possibility. I don't know when that became a possibility, but I bet you that is something that Putin didn't think through at all, or didn't even probably consider that possibility, that just a bunch of pissed off geeks behind a computer screen can basically take down the functioning of his country.
Yeah. What I was thinking about 15. I have two images in my mind, and this is why I don't want to talk so much about military history. I want to talk about this is like we're getting the correspondence, we're getting the information, and I'm remembering Russian state intelligent television, and the woman who came on behind the newsreader, and it said like "Stop the War" or something like that.
Yeah, I saw that.
And apparently there was a Putin rally in Moscow last night, and just as he was to make his major speech and raise his fist, the camera cut away from him. Now, who did that? How did that happen?
Yeah, was that hackers?
It
But
must have been.
they're doing all kinds of stuff like this, and I mean it's very disruptive, and yeah, I mean I think it's fascinating.
I think Brock and I are both chess players. Brock is a better analyst than I am. But the reason I bring up that analogy is if you play against the top of a line of computer, every single thing you play is going to be met. every threat you play is you're not going to get it. And I'm wondering if Russian intelligence is facing that same sort of thing, where you can't protect every bit of your border in a hostile country, and you can't allow your enemy to have assets on your line of communication. And yet Putin's trying to fight a war just like that. It's like when America was fighting with Mexico over Texas. The reason that the Alamo was so important was it was an American fortification on the Mexican supply line, and they took it. The Mexican took it, but they didn't tell it. They didn't they, they didn't hold that area for long. And yes, they lost San Jacinto really badly. I was going to make a joke about Texas, but I'm being charitable, so I won't. But the idea of having every move met, or fighting against an entity that you didn't have to worry about G forces, that must be a terrible experience and a terrible waste of manpower, because to train these experts and then lose them to something. With Moore's law, the weapons get better and better until we destroy ourselves with them. I mean, that's a cautionary. Kurt Vonnegut was one of the first writers that predicted that. He talked about entities living on a certain planet that fought and fought and fought, and then they decided to let the computers fight, and the computers killed all the humans, took over the planet. And that's the thing that maybe hangs on the horizon, but we're not really thinking about the horizon now. What we're trying to do is let the killing stop, make the killing stop, make the world safe for Ukrainian grandmothers. I mean, I wish we could do this for all. The other pretty interesting idea is America had a huge diplomatic success in 1948, and it's not taught in any history course that you can take in high school in Eau Claire, and it's probably not taught in many American history courses either. But we were in a position where we held the western part of Berlin, and the Soviet Union held the eastern part of Berlin. And the Soviets really did not want a free Berlin, because their part of Berlin looked like a pile of rubble, and West Berlin looked like an economic success. And so Stalin decided that rather than militarily attack Berlin and risk a World War III, because they're reasonable too, that they would simply blockade it. And so what America did was they did the Berlin airlift, and they set up one of the most efficient transfer of food, material, coal, anything else you can think of, to keep Berlin on life support for as long as they could. And by the end of the Berlin blockade, Stalin was embarrassed, and the West Germans were sending stuff like coal to their East German relatives, because West Berlin was so much better. And I think, I guess I'm giving up on being an isolationist too. I mean, I think America has got to live up to what it is. Can't believe I said that. But the idea of, I mean, if the world, that's another thing. We say we, like America controls everything. It doesn't. We're one of 212 countries. But if the world sends in humanitarian aid, and if that aid is destroyed, then something else happens. I mean, we're not safe anyway. It's like trying to placate a 13-year-old or something. What next will we use the threat? Well, how far into this have we gotten so far, Brock?
We can go a while longer. Yeah, one thing I find interesting, Phil, is this when we're talking about the technology, but I think the interesting thing is centralization versus decentralization. So on one
Yes.
side you got this the centralized autocrat, and on the other side you have like a decentralized force of hackers and you know just
Yeah.
lay people and countries and whatever, all trying to send aid to the Ukrainians. And on the other side you got Putin, just like one person trying to control everything in a world which is rapidly evolving into something where centralization becomes a bitch, because the Moore's law favors decentralization over time. And
Two things to carry out from here. Yeah.
and so yes, we could do a no-fly zone, and yes, we could crush militarily in a normal war, a non-nuclear war. I mean, we could wipe our ass with the shit he said in the Ukraine, right? Like, I mean, but wouldn't it be better if he got beat by a bunch of people all banding together in a decentralized fashion to go against like totalitarianism and in centralization of power? Wouldn't that have a better effect in the long run?
Well, yes, and as a matter of fact, my wife and I were talking about this. I I've studied French philosophers far too much, but there's some Michel Foucault is someone who's worth discussing because among other things, he fought in the resistance as a young man, and he said every night under the Nazis was a night of terror. But I think what we assume is that the state will have a monopoly on coercion and violence. And if we can think of a dispersed countervailing influence that contests that centralized force of the state. I mean, if you put a crowbar in a tank tread, it's going to break. If a drone, these drones now have the capability of of standing off for 24 hours above a target. Just think, if you're in a tank, you don't know which one it's going to be hit, but you know it's up there. Remember when I told you about the sword of Damocles? The guy. What is it? What is it like to be Putin? Well, it's like sitting at a banquet with a sword on a thread above your head, knowing it could fall at any time.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, I mean, we're all documenting war crimes now. We got a world of people that are seeing these war crimes in action. And as a matter of fact, one of my colleagues, and now I'm going to have to call him, one of my colleagues' sister wrote a UN book that set up the criteria for what what does it mean to do a war crime? If you do this and this, if you blow up a museum and try to destroy a culture, is that a war crime? Well, let's write that down someplace. Yeah. This idea of dispersed potentiality is a pretty interesting one. I mean, it brought one kind of revolution. Might it bring on a social revolution? And here I have, sitting in the other room, my wife just had Dr. Janice Bogstead just had a successful coronary procedure, and the technology that would have been used for the previous one 8 years ago had changed in a more powerfully. It's just not as hard as it was before, and that where did that technology come from? I don't know. It evolved. It evolved with geeks doing this. What did you say, Jan?
The technology allows them to use a smaller filament.
The technical detail is the technological advancement allowed them to use a smaller filament so they could go in through her arm rather than through her leg.
Hmm.
To get a little grimly philosophical about this, because I'm not going to preside over no picnic, you know. But Charlotte Burns used to head the philosophy department. And she and I we should have got along better, but I'm kind of an arrogant dork. But she talked about benefits, medical benefits that had come out of Nazi death camps. And her question was, well, did you just not use them because they were derived that way? I mean, I'm not gonna ask you to answer that question, Brock, because I can't answer it. But it belongs on some kind of curriculum where people have power to do something about that question, actually know what the hell they're talking about. It seems to me. I don't think you throw the technology away. I mean, that might get me tarred and feathered, but I don't think you do that. I think I don't feel like we're done with Moore's law by any means. I think as I told you about autonomous organizations funding their own drones, Ukraine has now issued a non-fungible token, supporting Ukrainian to fund the Ukrainian military effort. And I was just watching a video again of these guys. Their trucks are parked next to the road, and they're testing this thing, and they're doing it on their own time, and they're donating their expert knowledge, being able to do it. And this is so different from a bunch of academics exchanging each other's papers, getting a well-paid job in a think tank. I mean, what you would want is somebody that would do this, but not particularly like doing this, because he'd rather be home developing the video game rights to it.
Right. Yeah, it's like collective pragmatism for a purpose.
Go ahead, collective pragmatism. Go ahead. What does that mean exactly? I think I know what it means.
Well, I mean, instead of sitting around talking about what should be done and having a think tank, you collectively have a bunch of people decentrally working together with coming up with a pragmatic response, right? In the case you're talking about, it's, well, let's immobilize this $100 million jet with a $3 million drone, right? Think tank wouldn't come up with that.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's so much in the world where just a little bit of my money could make a difference in somebody's life if I could get it to them.
Right.
If I wouldn't have all of this friction from administrative salaries and academic conferences and just, I mean, how do you get to that poor person that you see? I mean, it rips your heart out to see the videos, and yet I'm supposed to give it to a third party to make it better. I don't trust a third party.
And that's where Moore's law will eventually, they've sent a lot of money in cryptocurrency over directly to the military. And then some of it they were able to send to the people that made it out, that made it to Poland or Lithuania or wherever they ended up. They were able to send them some of that money through cryptocurrency, because you don't have to deal with all these banking intermediaries and everything else. So you can actually get money to the people who need it practically instantly without all these barriers and friction. So, yeah, I mean, I really think I mean, we hadn't talked, so I didn't know what we were going to be talking about today. But I think it's really interesting. And I think there's a ton that could be talked about, but I do think I think you kind of pin down. I think that's in a nutshell. That's what's making the difference.
Yeah. Well, I remember you discussed there's sort of a trying to think of a you become a ethical athlete, so to speak, and so you go someplace where they don't where you're more under somebody's foot than you are really helping. When what they really need is for you to send your money and for that money to get them. You gave me an example of that with a situation you were familiar with, and that just jumps up in my mind. It's like the idea is to help the people. The idea is not necessarily to make yourself look good or get into heaven or not go to hell. You just want a box of hardtack. I don't care what it is, but something would be better than nothing. What I see so much about fundraising for good causes now, it's almost obscene the way they use the images and then make you feel helpless because it's behind a TV screen. I mean, what you're looking at is a bunch of pixels. I mean, if you saw that in person, what kind of monster wouldn't try to help somebody out? You know, I mean, you would feel almost a morally compelling hand. So, I have said about as much as I can for today.
Yeah, no, I think it was a good point. So do you want to end it there then?
Yeah.
All right.
By the way, I want to thank Kathy and my wife, and I'm working on the set, and I got a pillow behind me so I sit up straighter.
All right. Perfect. Stop.